It's 67 words long, it's 100 years old, and it changed the course of history for the Middle East and the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration, the expression of the British government's support for a Jewish home in Palestine, was sent by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the second Lord Rothschild. I'm here in Buckinghamshire at Waddesdon Manor to speak with the fourth Lord Rothschild about the Balfour Declaration, what it means for Britain, for the Jewish people and the Rothschild family.
The Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's Government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words: Dear Lord Rothschild. Why was it that this letter was sent by the Foreign Secretary to your great-uncle Walter?
It's an interesting question because he was really interested in ornithology, although he became interested in Zionism. I think the reason was this, that it was primarily a movement from Eastern Europe, but they didn't clarify who was in charge of that movement. And in addition, it was, after all, in Great Britain. So they felt that the Rothschild family should be the one to whom it was addressed. And Walter was Lord Rothschild, and he was a Zionist. And those really are the background reasons.
So Walter received the Balfour Declaration, and I have a copy here. And I wonder if I could possibly ask you to read it for us.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I'm going to put on my spectacles to make sure I read it accurately. His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour.
And here it is, the Balfour Declaration. What do you feel when you see it here?
I genuinely feel it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Jewish people. If you think it took 3,000 years to get to this, and then you say, how did this miracle happen? It's the most incredible piece of opportunism. I mean, if you think you had an impoverished would-be scientist, Chaim Weizmann, who somehow gets to England, meets a few people, including members of my family, seduces them. He has such great charm and conviction. He gets to Balfour, and he unbelievably persuades Balfour and Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and most of the ministers, that this idea of the national home for Jews should be allowed to take place. I mean, it's so unlikely. And then he starts to fight a difficult battle with the British cabinet, and this letter goes through 5 drafts, as you know. And in the end, it comes out as a rather compromising letter. I mean, the essential point is there for the Jewish community to fasten on to. You have the first bit, which promises a national home rather than the national home, and then you have the bit that nothing that's to be done should in any way harm the Arab community. But you come back to the big point, which is that this is perhaps the greatest event in Jewish life for thousands of years. And it's a miracle that it took place.
And of course, the Rothschild family then as now filled 2 roles, because it wasn't just a leader of diaspora Jewry, it also played a very significant role in the early years of the establishment of the pioneer communities in Israel as well.
There were two branches of the Rothschild family primarily concerned. One in France through Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who was the one who responded to the Russian programs of the 1880s. In England, there was a divide. Some of the Rothschilds, in particular Baron Edmond's son, James, known as Jimmy, had come from France, partly because of the Dreyfus case and his horror about what had happened, to live in England. He was educated at Cambridge University. And he married an English girl, Mrs. James de Rothschild, and she became a leader at a very young age. She was only 17 when she started writing to Weizmann and introducing him to the British establishment. Other Rothschilds felt it was better to be assimilated into English life, and although they retained their interest in Judaism and Jewish life, they didn't think it was a good thing that this national home should be established in Israel. So it was something that divided my family, as with many other families.
I wonder, as somebody who moves in the highest echelons of British society and is very close to Israel, whether you in your life feel a tension between concern for Israel and loyalty to Britain?
No, I don't personally feel that. I mean, I've been completely committed to Israel since the early 1960s and have been there every year since. So I don't feel that conflict, but I, of course, feel a huge loyalty.
It's been a point of controversy now for more than a decade. A researcher now from the University of Alaska Fairbanks is weighing in.
World Trade Center Building 7 was not struck by a plane, but did collapse hours after the Twin Towers. Well, now Dr. Leroy Hulsey, a civil engineering professor at UAF, he led a 4-year study which reevaluates whether Building 7's collapse could have been caused by fire, as was determined by the National Institute for Standards and Technology in 2008. Hulsey says his findings were a resounding no, and his simulations paint a different picture than the federal agencies.
So we virtually simulated the building, and we looked at that analysis, and we also virtually simulated what they did. We couldn't get it to do what they were at. They did.
A group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth paid for the study. The organization is petitioning Congress to call for a new investigation into the World Trade Center destruction. A spokesperson for the organization says one of its supporters approached Dr. Hulsey about the research, partly because of UAF's reputation.
When we started talking to Dr. Hulsey, it became very clear that the engineering program at University of Alaska Fairbanks was very strong. And Dr. Hulsey was the chair of the department, and he had a lot of experience in modeling structures and doing forensic investigations. And so we thought it was a perfect opportunity for us to move forward.
The study is now open for a 2-month public comment period. We'll post a link to the report on our website at ktba.com.
I'm Leanne McAdoo with Infowars.com, reporting here from Times Square. I am standing next to Rudy Dent. He's a 32-year veteran of the New York City Fire Department. He's worked as well with the New York City Police Department. And you retired right after 9/11. He was there on 9/11. He saw World Trade Center Tower 7 come down. Rudy, tell us about what happened that day.
Well, I was off that day, and I received a call at home, and I got to see both buildings come down on TV. I jumped on my motorcycle. I did about 120 miles an hour across the Tappan Zee. I reported to my firehouse, and then I got my gear. A bunch of us got together. We commandeered a mail truck, and we made our way down to the site. At that time, Building 7 was still up. I saw Building 7 come down. My fellow firefighters who were there, they did that involuntary jerk when a loud explosion goes off. You can't help it, and they did. I'm a Vietnam veteran too, so I kind of didn't jump like they did, but there was an explosion. The building did come down in complete classical controlled demolition. It came down on its own footprint. There's no question about that. As a matter of fact, Richard Gage from Architects and Engineers has completely handled that from his area of expertise. Okay.
Now, we heard rumblings, things that the fire department was saying that they were overhearing Larry Silverstein talking about, talking to his insurance company of whether or not he should have the building pulled. In your professional opinion, was the building pulled?
Well, let me say this. In the New York City Fire Department, as I said, I had 32 years there. I was a chauffeur, and I was also a trained fire marshal. A fire marshal is considered an expert witness in court. He's like a forensic detective. He has the power to administer the oath, take testimony, and issue a subpoena. That's a lot of power. And he's a highly trained investigative person in his area of expertise, in arson. And we have no term that I know of that says pulling buildings. That's not our area of expertise. We've never done that. We don't do that. So for him to say that, I don't know where he pulled that out of, but it's just not part of our operations, okay?
Right, so the fire department doesn't have the training to pull a building, to demo a building like that.
We're not trained to do that. We've never done that in my 32 years. I know of no evolution whatsoever that does that.
And then talk to me a little bit, obviously, as a professional in the fire department for 30 plus years, they're saying that blaming it on office fires, just a few office fires.
Well, if it wasn't so serious a situation, that would be completely laughable. That is ridiculous. First of all, our guys were up there. They were calling for additional hand lines to mop up the isolated pockets of fire. And let me just explain one thing. Never in the history of the world, never in the history of high-rise skyscrapers has ever a skyscraper ever come down because of fire. And I'm talking massive fire. And you know the reason why? Because fire does not burn by itself hot enough to compromise and melt steel. What we had in the World Trade Center, and I saw myself, was molten lava-like pockets of molten steel. All right, I spent the night on the pile searching for bodies, and I saw that with my own eyes. So who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe a bunch of government bureaucrats or my fellow brothers, which I lost 343 guys that day? And I lost Tommy O'Hagan, Bruce Van Hines, and Kenny Kumpel. And I can never forget that. I think of that before I go to bed. I think about it the first thing in the morning when I wake up. And it's in honor of them and their family that I will continue to do everything I can to make the rest of the world wake up to the fact that this was a false flag operation.
We need a popular resistance to this. We need, it's like I grew up during the Vietnam time, and there was a popular resistance to the war in Vietnam. We don't see anything like that in this country today. 16 years. You have to remember that the War on Terror is the longest war in U.S. history at this point, the oldest war in U.S. history, and also the most expensive war in U.S. history. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. Originally started out to go after the terrorists who committed 9/11, many of whom supposedly died on 9/11. So going after a ragtag group of students and Taliban in Afghanistan, that shouldn't take more than a couple of weeks. But from the very beginning, they said this is going to take decades. Mm-hmm. Well, why? Because they knew that the real underlying strategy for the war on terror was to redraw the map of the Middle East, to conquer territories, and to cut the Arab countries into pieces. And that would take some time.
So yeah, you talk about sectarian enclaves. Mm-hmm. They want to have a Kurdistan. How does that benefit Israel to break up their surrounding Muslim countries into smaller sectarian groups? Is it just because they're fighting with one another, and that Israel, if they're smaller countries, that Israel is more powerful?
Well, yeah. First of all, if they can break up the Yinon Plan, the Oded Yinon Plan of 1982 made very clear that on the Eastern Front, Israel's primary targets were Iraq and Syria, in that order. And the first thing they wanted to do was to destroy the military of Iraq and Syria, and then to fragment the country along its ethnic lines or religious lines. It's called balkanization because it's exactly what was done to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large country, a socialist country. They broke it up into 6 or 7 statelets. And for Israel, that would mean that the other countries in the neighborhood would be similar ethnic states, and Israel is just another ethnic state. So they would have some moral justification in a neighborhood where everybody is similar, ethnic states. And then also they obviously weakened the big Ba'ath states, the big Arab states like Iraq and Syria, and Saudi Arabia's on the chopping block too. So it's like nobody. It's happened to Libya, it's happened to Lebanon and Yemen and Sudan. It's the game plan.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia is going to give up some of their land to Israel? Because if you look at the Greater Israel Project, the Eretz Promised Land, that goes into Saudi Arabia. Are they going to? Because it seems like they're working together with ISIS, and they're not exposing them for 9/11. They work together on 9/11 and arming the Mujahideen. Mm-hmm. So is there a deal worked out where they're going to give them the Promised Land at one point, you believe?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how it's going to shake out, but I have seen that, the maps of this balkanization of the Middle East do affect Saudi Arabia. They're trying to achieve this plan. And in Syria right now, they're breaking the country up into 3 pieces or 4 pieces. And Iraq has already been broken up into 3 pieces. As I said, on the 25th of September, there will be a referendum in Kurdistan to become independent of Iraq. That's what they want to do, but there are obstacles along the way. In the case of Syria, there's been some obstacles in the form of Iran and the Russian military.
In the foreword to your book, Alan Sobrowski writes that you're optimistic that Trump might disclose 9/11 truth. I'm not sure when he wrote that, if he had already bombed Syria and revamped the war in Afghanistan, but do you still have that sentiment about Trump?
Well, I mean, I hope that Trump will do something about 9/11 truth and ending the war. He spoke about these things when he didn't speak about 9/11 truth specifically, but he did talk about having better relations with Russia, ending the conflict in Syria, and he has done some good things. He's pulled out from the CIA funding of the Syrian rebels. The war in Syria is now coming to a conclusion, largely because the United States has pulled back its support. So that's a good thing. The sooner the war in Syria is over, the sooner we get some balance, the better. I would have preferred that Donald Trump from the very beginning took a more muscular policy on ending the wars in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. But he didn't do that.
What do you think about his relationship with Silverstein and Netanyahu and the Kushners? Mm-hmm. You really think that's possible, that there's any chance that he will do that?
Well, he has had very close relations with Israelis and American Zionists for a long time. But that doesn't mean that he's in cahoots with the 9/11 cover-up. I would hope that as a New Yorker and as an American, he would not cover up the truth of 9/11, which is the fundamental thing that I'm talking about here. You can as a political leader, and when he ran for office, he told his policy guy that he wants to be the most pro-Israeli candidate out there. He was saying that because he wanted to win the election. But I would hope that even though he has these relations with these Zionists, that he is not party to the 9/11 crime or the cover-up.
I think he's a part of the cover-up because on 9/11 he said the buildings were so strong and he thought there was more than planes and bombs, and then a few days later he changed his tune completely and said that, it's kamikazes and they're terrorists and there's nothing that would have stopped the buildings from coming down.
Right, that's right. He said on 11th of September, he said that there had been most likely bombs that went off simultaneously with the plane impacts, which is pretty true, pretty correct. I mean, a good observation. And as you said, 2 days later, he changed his tune. So whether somebody called him up and told him to change his tune is most likely the case. But that's happened all across the U.S., I saw a professor from New Mexico Tech. He did the same thing. On day 1, he spoke truth about 9/11. 10 days later, he changed his tune. And this is political. I think it's the politic thing to do for these people. They want to either keep their position, they want to keep their funding, they want to stay on the right side of the tracks, and so they go along with the cover-up.
Can you talk about your frustration, or do you ever think about giving up the fight for 9/11?
That's a good question because no, I haven't. I've never thought about giving up, and I can tell you that it's been very difficult. It's been very difficult at times, but it would be worse to give up, especially knowing what I know, and having done the research that I've done over a period of years. It would be just stupid to give up, but more than that, it's like to give up and to give to let the lie go on for even one more day. It would be a sin. It's wrong. Yeah. And this whole thing is so wrong. The way these people have hijacked our reality. The first chapter of this book, The War on Terror, it's like living with here it is, coping with artificial reality. Because in the 16 years since 9/11, that's where this country's been. The United States has been in this artificial reality. We've been given a lie about what happened on 9/11, and based on that lie, we've gone to war. We're waged war against half a dozen Islamic nations. We've done terrible devastation to places like Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've done great damage to this country. The cost of the war on terror is at least $2.5 trillion right now. That's not counting future costs down the road, which will double that. I mean, this is suicidal. And, I love this country, and I want to see this country restore some of its integrity and get back on track. It's like the country's been hijacked. There's no better way to say it. The country's been hijacked, and when the country's been hijacked, you can't just sit back in your first-class seat drinking champagne and not worry where the plane's going. You got to turn it around.